For 40 straight quarters, GE's earnings were perfect. Nobody's earnings are ever perfect. In 1999, Fortune magazine named Jack Welch the greatest manager of the 20th century. It was not a controversial choice at the time. For 20 years as CEO of General Electric, Welch had overseen a transformation of one of America's oldest and most complex industrial companies into the most valuable corporation in the world. GE's market capitalization under his leadership grew from $14 billion to $410 billion. For 40 consecutive quarters, 10 straight years, GE reported earnings that met or beat analyst expectations almost to the penny. The consistency was treated as proof of genius. It was, in significant part, proof of something else. This is the story of how GE's legend was built, what it was built on, and what it eventually cost the people who believed in it. To understand what happened at GE, you need to understand what Jack Welch actually built, and why the world was so eager to believe every number that came out of it. Welch became CEO of General Electric in 1981, inheriting a company that was already one of America's most storied industrial enterprises, founded by Thomas Edison and built over a century into a conglomerate spanning power generation, aircraft engines, medical imaging equipment, industrial machinery, and broadcasting. GE was not a startup, it was an institution, and Welch's ambition was to make it the most valuable institution in the world. His management philosophy was relentless and, in its own way, visionary. He insisted that GE would only compete in markets where it could be number one or number two. Everything else would be fixed, sold, or closed. He earned his early nickname, Neutron Jack, by eliminating over 100,000 jobs in his first years as CEO, flattening layers of management, and forcing an organizational discipline that GE's bureaucratic culture had previously resisted. The results, measured in shareholder returns, were extraordinary. GE stock became one of the defining investments of the 1990s bull market, and Welch became the avatar of a new kind of CEO, hard, decisive, metrics-driven, allergic to sentimentality. Central to GE's financial performance was a division that most consumers had never heard of and that most analysts, for a very long time, did not scrutinize closely enough. GE Capital was the financial services arm of General Electric, a business that had begun as a way to help consumers finance purchases of GE appliances and had grown over decades into one of the largest financial institutions in the world in its own right. By the 1990s, GE Capital was generating a substantial proportion of GE's total profits, and its flexibility as a financial entity, its ability to time the recognition of gains and losses, to hold assets on or off balance sheet in ways that industrial companies could not, and to deploy capital across a vast range of financial products, gave GE's management an instrument for managing the company's reported earnings that no pure industrial company possessed. This instrument was used, investigators and critics later concluded, with a consistency and deliberateness that went beyond normal financial management into something that deserved a more uncomfortable description. When GE's industrial businesses fell short of earnings targets in a given quarter, GE Capital could be used to fill the gap by timing the sale of appreciated assets, by adjusting the recognition of insurance reserves, or by deploying its flexibility in ways that were individually defensible but cumulatively amounted to using a financial subsidiary to manufacture the consistency that Welch's reputation demanded. The 40 consecutive quarters of matched expectations were not, critics argued, a testament to the precision of Welch's management. They were a testament to the precision of GE Capital's role as an earnings management tool, a role that was understood by GE senior leadership and, for years, by no one else. The most significant and ultimately most damaging form of financial management at GE involved its insurance business. GE Capital had accumulated, over the decades, a large portfolio of long-term care insurance policies. Insurance that pays for nursing home and home health care costs for elderly policyholders who can no longer care for themselves. Long-term care insurance is notoriously difficult to price accurately because it requires actuaries to make decades-long predictions about how long policyholders will live, what medical care they will require, and what that care will cost. In the 1970s and 1980s, when many of these policies were written, actuarial assumptions significantly underestimated how long people would live and how expensive their care would become. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was becoming clear to insurance industry specialists that long-term care insurance policies written in earlier decades were generating claims at rates far above what the original pricing had assumed. Companies across the industry were being forced to take significant charges to increase their insurance reserves, the money set aside to pay future claims. GE's insurance reserve problem was, it eventually emerged, one of the largest in the industry, reflecting the enormous size of its long-term care insurance portfolio. What GE did not do, for years, was disclose the full scale of this problem to investors. The company made some reserve increases over time, but critics, and eventually regulators, concluded that those increases were consistently inadequate relative to the true scale of the liability, and that GE's management had made choices about reserve levels that prioritized the company's reported earnings over accurate financial disclosure. By keeping reserves lower than they should have been, GE was able to report better earnings than its true financial position justified, not through outright fabrication, but through the consistent application of optimistic assumptions that were difficult for outsiders to challenge, and that conveniently produced results supporting the company's earnings targets. The SEC investigated GE's accounting practices, and in 2009 reached a settlement with the company for $200 million. At the time, one of the largest SEC accounting fraud settlements in history. The SEC found that GE had used improper accounting methods in 4 separate areas, including the timing of locomotive sales and the accounting for interest rate swaps, to avoid missing analyst earnings expectations on multiple occasions. The settlement described conduct that, while the SEC characterized it as improper accounting rather than outright fabrication, had the effect of manufacturing the appearance of smoother, more consistent earnings than the underlying business actually generated. The full scale of the insurance reserve problem did not become publicly apparent until 2018, when GE disclosed that it expected to take a charge of approximately $6.2 billion to increase its long-term care insurance reserves, and that it had agreed to contribute $15 billion in capital to its insurance subsidiary over 7 years to address the shortfall. The total long-term exposure that analysts ultimately attributed to GE's long-term care insurance portfolio ran to approximately $38 billion, a liability that had been building for decades, while GE's leadership was being celebrated for the company's financial consistency and discipline. Here is what makes this case different from every other case on this channel. GE never had a single villain who orchestrated everything. The problem was more dangerous than that. It was a culture, an entire institution that had learned to make numbers behave. Stay with me. Jack Welch retired as CEO of General Electric in September 2001, handing the company to his chosen successor, Jeff Immelt, on one of the most consequential days in American history, September 7, 2001, 4 days before the September 11th attacks. The timing was not symbolic, but it was instructive. Immelt inherited not only a company already navigating the beginning of a severe economic disruption, but a financial structure whose vulnerabilities would take years to fully become apparent. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, GE Capital faced significant losses in its aviation leasing business. GE was one of the world's largest aircraft lessors, and the collapse in air travel that followed the attacks devastated the values of aircraft it held in its portfolio. GE also had insurance exposure to the attacks through its reinsurance operations. The stress on GE Capital began revealing, slowly, that the financial cushion the company's management had always claimed was thinner than reported. Immelt's tenure as CEO was defined by the progressive unwinding of the GE Capital model that had sustained Welch's earnings record. As the 2008 financial crisis arrived, GE Capital, now one of the largest and most complex financial institutions in the world, deeply embedded in commercial real estate lending, structured credit, and other financial products that were at the epicenter of the crisis, came within what some analysts later described as days of a liquidity failure. The U.S. government's decision to extend its guarantee program to GE Capital's debt in October 2008 was, many commentators concluded, what prevented a collapse that would have been of systemic importance to the American financial system. The near failure of GE Capital during the financial crisis was the moment when the full cost of building a vast financial subsidiary inside an industrial company, and using that subsidiary to manage earnings, began to become apparent to the investment community in a way it had not previously been. The SEC's $200 million settlement in 2009 was publicly framed as addressing specific accounting issues, but it also served as a signal that regulators had found, on examination, that GE's earnings management had crossed lines that the company's management had long maintained it had stayed safely within. In 2015, Immelt announced that GE would divest the majority of GE Capital's assets, essentially dismantling the earnings management machine that had been central to GE's financial identity for 3 decades. The announcement was framed as a strategic pivot toward GE's industrial roots. It was also, implicitly, an acknowledgement that the GE Capital model, the model that had produced Welch's legendary consistency, was no longer defensible. The process of winding down GE Capital exposed losses, write-downs, and reserve inadequacies that had been embedded in the portfolio for years. Each disclosure confirmed, piece by piece, that the smoothness of GE's earnings under Welch had been sustained in part by deferring problems that eventually became impossible to defer. The legend was cracking. It had been cracking for a very long time. The decline of General Electric, following the financial crisis, was one of the most dramatic falls from grace in American corporate history, and it unfolded slowly enough that each stage of the descent felt surprising, even though the trajectory was, in retrospect, consistent. GE's stock, which had peaked near $60 per share during the Welch era, fell below $7 in the aftermath of the 2018 insurance disclosure. The company, that had once been the most valuable in the world, was removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 2018, an index it had been part of continuously since 1907. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Jeff Immelt resigned as CEO in 2017, his tenure defined by the progressive unraveling of the Welch-era financial model. He was replaced by John Flannery, who served less than a year before being replaced by Larry Culp in 2018, GE's first outside CEO in its history. Culp's mandate was to restructure a company that had become so complex, so burdened by GE Capital's legacy liabilities, and so far removed from the industrial excellence it had historically claimed as its core identity, that the question of whether GE was even a viable standalone entity had become legitimate. Under Culp's leadership, GE undertook a radical simplification, selling businesses, paying down debt, and focusing the company on 3 core industrial segments: aviation, power, and healthcare. The healthcare business was eventually spun off as an independent company. The power business required years of painful restructuring, as the energy market shifted away from the gas turbines that GE had long dominated. The aviation business, which had always been GE's strongest industrial operation, became the primary source of genuine value that kept the restructuring story alive for investors. Jack Welch himself died in March 2020, at the age of 84, before the full accounting of GE's long-term care insurance exposure had been publicly settled, and before the company had completed its transformation. His legacy, which had been treated as unambiguous during his lifetime, became the subject of serious reassessment in the years following his death, as the full picture of GE's earnings management during his tenure became clearer. The question that business scholars and commentators increasingly asked was not whether Welch had been a great manager. The operational transformations he implemented at GE were real, and their effects durable, but whether the earnings consistency that defined his legend had been as genuine as the world believed. The honest answer, based on the SEC's findings and the subsequent disclosures made under Immelt and Culp, was that it had not been entirely genuine. The 40 consecutive quarters were real, the discipline and the focus were real, but the smoothness, the almost miraculous consistency that had made Welch a legend, had been sustained in part by mechanisms that deferred problems rather than solved them, and that allowed a financial institution embedded inside an industrial company to perform a function that the industrial company's actual operations could not. The numbers had done what Welch told them to do. The cost of that obedience fell on the investors who came after. Before we finish, drop one word in the comments. Does what GE did under Welch count as fraud, or just aggressive accounting that everyone in corporate America was doing at the time? One word: fraud. Or system? Because the answer changes who you think is responsible. I read every single one. Some frauds are obvious, some are hidden in footnotes. The next case we're covering was hidden in plain sight for decades, inside one of the most watched industries in the world. Subscribe.